Okay, so good afternoon and welcome everybody. Our guest this afternoon, well, he may need no introduction in Turin. Professor Mirko Canevaro is a professor of Greek history at the University of Edinburgh. His range is extremely broad in classical Greek history, going from ancient Athenian law to Athenian social history to Greek political theory. He participated in the commentary on Aristotle's politics with his erstwhile Turin teacher, Lucio Bertelli, somebody you might also be familiar with. And he's currently starting a new large research project supported by the ERC on class struggle in the ancient Greek democracy. The paper that he would be presenting this afternoon is connected very clearly with this new project. And it's called Nativism versus Class Denigration, Athenian Autochthony between Exclusion and Inclusion. Welcome, Mirko.
Thank you very much.
Oh, and there's a handout for the talk on the third row. Sorry, I couldn't find a better place to put it.
I just wonder if I can stand, essentially. So does the microphone pick me up if I speak from here? Allora bisognerebbe... Ci vorrebbe, Bianca, il volume degli iscritti di Luigi Einaudi da alzare il... As I was shorter, anybody has a book?
Because you don't speak in the well, just
okay. Well, anyway, well, first of all, thanks again for having me. I mean, I feel like this is becoming increasingly like home. Turin already felt like home, but now Palazzo d'Azeglio and the Turin Humanities program has become a home away from home. So thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for having me. And I'll jump straight in. So tonight we're talking about nativism and class denigration in Athens. So the fact is, it is sometimes hard to like the Athenians. Take the passage from Lycurgus against Theocritus in your point 1 on the handout. Lycurgus is praising those who died at the Battle of Chaeronea for their bravery in fighting for the freedom of all Greeks despite their defeat. Nothing wrong with that, right? And yet, Lycurgus chooses to frame his praise in a rather distasteful manner, at least for us. He first justifies their bravery as the result of shame at the thought of the land that reared them being ravaged by enemies. Then he proceeds to contrast the Athenians to the other Greeks through a simile. Just as a father naturally, allegedly, feels less affection for his adopted sons than for his natural children, so too other Greeks are bound to feel less affection for land that is not naturally their own. The Athenians, that is, are braver because of a deeper bond with their land. That there is a superiority in having a deeper bond with your land is a common theme in the orators, something that appears to have been perceived by the Athenians as very effective praise. Demosthenes, in his funeral oration, the second text at point 1 on the handout, compares those who come as migrants to their cities, epeludas, to adopted children, whereas only those who settle in the very land in which they were born and hand it down to their descendants can be considered citizens of their fatherland by right of legitimate birth. In Isocrates, the third text at 1 on the handout, this deeper connection with the land is also combined with disparaging words about those who came to inhabit a land by driving others out of it, or moved there when they found it uninhabited, or, God forbid, came together as motley hordes composed of many different ethnic. We find similarly disparaging words about the majority of people assembled together from all sorts of places, casting out their predecessors and living on land which was not originally their own in Lysias' funeral speech, The contrast is, once again, with the autochthonous Athenians. These are all well-known passages and well-known themes. They are evidence of the purchase in classical Athens of an ideology of autochthony that underpin notions of Athenian superiority. This ideology derived from a merging of traditions, as it were. On the one hand, the belief that Erythonius, the mythical king of Attica and mythical kings of Attica were sprung of the earth. On the other, the idea that the Athenians never moved, that they inhabited Attica continuously since their earliest origins. These traditions combined into the notion that the Athenians as a whole sprung from the earth and never left Attica. Athenian democratic citizenship, as scholars have come to acknowledge since the groundbreaking work of Nicole Leroux, was founded, that is, on ideas of exceptionalism and ethnic distinctiveness. In this sense, as argued, for instance, by Susan Leip, it was in fact a form of racial citizenship that connected membership of the community with consanguinity. Influential mythical stories recounted particularly in the extant funeral orations, although never quite fully settled and always rather malleable, as shown recently by Matteo Barbato, underpin these notions of ethnic and racial superiority and provided a justification for a citizenship law, Pericles citizenship law, and later for further laws that expressly discouraged and eventually prohibited the mixing or dilution of Athenian blood through marriage with foreign women. At a basic level, then, democratic citizenship was justified through the othering and the explicit denigration of foreigners, whether they lived in Athens or in other Greek cities. The story I have sketched so far summarizes roughly one of the main trends in the study of the ideology of autochthony for a good 40 years now. It is a story that is hardly defined. The picture it paints is one of a democracy founded on exclusion, on nativism and xenophobia. It has shared the spotlight, rather uneasily, with another story, at times equally popular in scholarship, that connects autochthony instead with democratic egalitarianism. The common origin of all Athenians from the Attic land is the foundation, in this story, of their equality. Plato's Menexenus, point 2 on your handout, provides a clear illustration. There's a handout somewhere. I've got another one. Anyway, right. So Plato's Menexenus, for instance, provides a clear illustration of this ideological connection. Socrates argues that the mixed origin of the citizens in other cities is the reason for the prevalence elsewhere of tyranny and oligarchy, whereas in Athens, isogonia, in accordance with nature, kataphysin, results in isonomia, in accordance with the law, katanomon. And Hyperides, in the second text at point 2 of your handout, for instance, relies on this very principle when he stresses that in Athens, unlike in other cities, there is no point in relating individually the noble ancestry of each Athenian because all Athenians share the same ancestry and therefore the same superior nobility. This story, as is clear even just from these two short passages, is not just one of egalitarianism, but also one of democratic appropriation of the language of good birth and nobility, eugeneia, which, through the ideology of autochthony, is extended to all Athenians. Eugeneia, that is, stops being an axis of social differentiation for the elites and becomes the grounds for egalitarian inclusion for all citizens. So in this talk tonight, I do not intend to argue for either of these approaches against the other. It seems to me rather clear that they are both, in a sense, correct, and the evidence can be plausibly read to support both. What I'm going to argue, rather, is that both approaches are too static. They fail, that is, satisfactorily, to place the discourse of autochthony where it belongs, in an ideological battlefield Athenian and Greek more widely, where the very notion of the participation of the lower classes in the running of the polis was contested, challenged, actively opposed by the elites. Autochthony, that is, came to perform a very specific justificatory function in opposition to arguments and allegations that the demos, characterized as dominated by the lower classes, was not worthy to rule. Its role can be fully appreciated only in connection with the specular articulation of a sophisticated aristocratic ideology whose purpose was instead to disqualify the masses and eventually disenfranchise them. This ideological battle cannot be reconstructed in its entirety, but we can see fragments of it in the evidence. What I shall try to do tonight is to arrange these fragments into something resembling a debate. In doing so, I shall not pretend to dispose these fragments diachronically, indicating precisely which steps of the arguments had chronological priority, building a notional sequence of the development of the debate and tying it to particular moments and events of Athenian history. When I do indicate that a particular ideological or argumentative step comes first, these must be read for the purpose of my discussion in terms of logical priority. My concern is to identify what particular position or positions each argumentative strategy was meant to answer, reconstructing, therefore, a topography, as it were, rather than a chronology of the overall debate. Accordingly, I shall not assume that each given text I analyze represents exclusively one particular step of the debate, only one position. I shall look into each text, rather, to find evidence of the positions in circulation in the wider debate, allowing, therefore, for the possibility that one single text may shift between and engage with different positions, even between positions that are incompatible with each other. So my starting point in reconstructing this debate is a rather obvious one. The constitution of the Athenians by the so-called old oligarch, and you have a passage at 3 on the handout. This treatise is a repository of elitism and class denigration of a kind that, although not universally embraced by the Athenian upper classes, must have been fairly widespread and promptly recognizable in the late 5th century BC and beyond. The old oligarch draws a sharp line between the few and the many, identified as the demos, and considered to be the majority in the city, governing it according to their own self-interest. That's what they think. The terminology used in the treatise to indicate the few unproblematically conflates good birth, wealth, and moral excellence. The few are rich, plusioi, clever, dexiotatoi, prosperous, well-to-do, eudaimones, as well as the best men, beltistoi, aristoi. And of course, they are well-born from a good family, genaioi, he says. And as they are all these things, they are, of course, hoi krestoi, the most useful, the worthiest, the word most often used to describe them. Accordingly, they are characterized by acribeia eista cresta, scrupulousness over what is valuable, arete, sophia, and eunomia. Conversely, in the terms of the old oligarch uses to indicate the many, poverty, belonging to the lower classes as inferiority, manual labor and toil, as well as moral disapprobation, are seamlessly conflated. The masses are referred to as the poor, penetes, the insane or undisciplined, mainomenoi, the lower and therefore inferior class, oikeirus, the worst class, to kakiston, and of course, the bad, the worthless, oiponeroi. They are characterized by licentiousness, akolasia, injustice, adikia, ignorance and lack of education, amathia and apaideusia, disorder, ataxia, as well as, of course, poverty, lack of money, penia, endeia crematum. The conflation of virtue, dignity, and worth with wealth and good birth is the driving feature of the language of class in the treatise, with some oscillation on whether it is good birth or wealth that are most important, but an assumption that they are normally aligned, they go together. Conflating negative moral judgments with socioeconomic labels in a discussion of why democracy is undesirable allows the author and those who shared his views ultimately to paint those who run the democracy in Athens, the masses, as supremely undeserving by any possible criterion of worth, be it wealth, good birth, or virtue. And the politeia in the hands of those who are unworthy, however understandable their rule may be on utilitarian grounds, something the old oligarch acknowledges, is by definition an unjust regime. Here, it is perhaps useful to jump forward a good century and remind ourselves of Aristotle's taxonomy of political regimes presented in Politics 3, and again in his account of the causes of stasis in Politics 5, which is the second text at handout 3. Aristotle's contention, a descriptive rather than a prescriptive one, is that there are multiple constitutions because everyone agrees on justice as proportional equality, katanalogian ison, that is, on equality according to worth, to value, kataxian. But they make mistakes about it, that's what he thinks. Democracy, he claims, comes into being because those who are equal in one respect believe themselves to be equal absolutely. Because they are equal insofar as they are free, they believe they should also be equal in all other respects. Oligarchy, on the other hand, arises because those who are unequal in one respect believe themselves to be unequal in every respect. Because they are unequal in wealth, they are convinced that they should be unequal absolutely in all respects. Likewise, aristocracy comes into being because virtuous people adopt a conception of proportional justice, kataxian, according to worth, by which wealth and honor should be distributed in accordance with virtue. And those who are superior by lineage, for example, entertain a conception of proportional justice, according to worth, by which wealth and honor should be distributed in proportion to ancestral prominence and wealth. Despite the differences, particularly in terms of sophistication of the two accounts, it is easy to see that the old oligarch's positions and Aristotle's share some common presuppositions. Democracy cannot claim to bring about a proportionally just distribution of honor, wealth, and power by any criterion of worth, lineage, wealth, virtue, except the most basic and undifferentiating one, freedom. Only if we believe that the only relevant criterion of worth is being free, as opposed to being a slave, we can agree that democracy is a just arrangement. And as few would actually agree to such a narrow definition of what makes you worthy, then democracy as a regime that is inclusive of all Athenian males, adult males, irrespective of socioeconomic condition, is by definition, in these accounts, unjust. We have here, therefore, an ideology of class denigration whose purpose is to undermine democracy's claims to justice and therefore its very legitimacy by painting the masses as quintessentially undeserving of political power, honor, and participation. Its purpose is to exclude the lower classes from the running of the polis. It is important to note, however, that Aristotle's characterization of the democracy's conception of proportional justice according to worth of choice was in fact is in fact a straw man argument of sorts. Because it is not true, in fact, that the Democrats' favorite criterion of worth of choice was in fact freedom alone. That is certainly not how the democratic response to these kinds of arguments goes. On the one hand, we find attempts to turn the old oligarch's characterization on its head. One just needs to think of Theseus' defense of democracy in Euripides' Suppliants, for point 4 on your handout. There, he rejects the twofold division between few and many and replaces it with a threefold one between the rich, the poor, and those in the middle. In his account, it is the rich who are useless, anopheles, and therefore, by definition, unworthy. And let's think of Euripides' Electra, where Electra's husband, a peasant out of Goss, is construed as a living and walking computation of the old oligarch's conflation of poverty and lower status with lack of virtue or unworthiness. For this man, says Orestes in the play, who is not eminent among the Argives, not yet puffed up by family reputation, but belongs among the many, and tois pollois, has been found excellent, Aristos. Orestes pronounces these words in the context of a wider discussion of virtue, in which he goes through and dismisses, one after the other, various criteria used commonly to identify who is virtuous. The speech starts with the words, "Before now, I've seen a worthless man sprung from a noble father, and estimable children from low-born parents. Emptiness I've seen in a rich man's thinking, and a great mind in a poor man's body. How then shall a man distinguish and rate them correctly? By wealth, a faulty guide he'll then be using, or by lack of possessions? All of the old oligarchs' criteria of worth seem to be criticized here as unreliable. But discounting wealth in its connection with birth as reliable criteria of worth is not the only strategy used by Democrats to neutralize this ideology of class denigration, nor is it the most widespread, or probably the most effective. In Euripides' Electra itself, the argument is not just that wealth and good birth are no guarantee of virtue, and that also a man who is poor and cannot claim noble ancestry can actually be virtuous. The argument is, in fact, that a poor man can also be well-born. Electra introduces her husband to Orestes as a poor but noble man and respectful to me, using the word genaios, and thus implicitly disaggregating not only virtue and wealth, but also good birth and wealth. And in the prologue, the husband describes himself as distinguished in family, but poor in possessions, which is the ruin of nobility. The distinction of his family is not a special one. It derives from him being sprung from Mycenaean stock, a rather transparent allusion to the Athenians' pretensions of nobility on account of being sprung from the Attic earth, likely to find the sympathy of the audience. There was an Athenian audience. And here is precisely where the ideology of autochthony comes in, becoming the linchpin of the demos's claims to worth. The demos and the lower classes in particular become worthy of honor and power, not by rejecting the traditional criteria of worth that the old oligarch denies the masses, but rather by appropriating them. Autochthony, as we have seen, provides a nativist underpinning to the worthiness of the masses and to the equality of all citizens by extending good birth, eugeneia, to all Athenians. As Hyperides says in his funeral speech, there is no need to making a long song and dance about the lineage of each of the fallen, Athenian fallen individually. They are all Athenians, autochthonous and indigenous, and therefore by definition, eugenes, by definition, well-born. More so, in fact, than the citizen bodies of other cities, however narrowly defined, because these are mixtures made out of immigrants from many places, whose right to the land they inhabit and govern is intrinsically inferior to the Athenians to their own. Autochthony, by its very exclusionary nature, becomes the justification for the inclusion of the lower classes in the running of the polis on a level with the elites. Alcibiades, in the Sicilian debate, appeals to this very ideological tenet in front of a popular audience in the assembly when he mocks the motley mobs of the Sicilian cities, whose lack of autochthony makes them unpatriotic and prone to stasis, unlike Athens. The word autochthony is not used there explicitly, but it is strongly implied by references to hokloi summeitoi, which reminds one of the disparaging words used of non-autochthonous populations, for example, in Demosthenes, Isocrates, and Lysias. And the contrast is once again with the autochthonous Athenians. The most telling statement, I think, of this justificatory strategy, which displays it and parodies it at the same time, is perhaps to be found in Aristophanes' Wasp, which is the last passage at point 4 of the handout, where the eponymous wasps of the chorus, characterized explicitly throughout the play as old lower-class Athenian men relying on dicastic pay for their survival, announce, "We are true Attic men, who alone are native, engenes, and autochthonous, the bravest of all people." What I want to attempt to identify now is a further step of the debate of which the discourse of autochthony was part. Once again, I stress that I do not envisage these, in the context of my reconstruction, as steps in a temporal sense, emerging at different points in Athenian history, but as logical steps, argumentative options that were available and enacted repeatedly in the heated ideological context of the classical Athenian democracy already in the 5th century. So my aim now is to isolate a most insidious and most influential response to the discourse of autochthony, emerging, as far as the evidence indicates, in certain philosophical circles and associated with certain radically anti-democratic sections of the elite. So I'll pick up the thread of this response from a rather less obvious place this time, from the extant evidence about Antisthenes, an influential pupil of Socrates and older contemporary of Plato. Diogenes Laertius, in a passage that you have at 5 on your handout, tells us that Antisthenes was an Athenian, yet he was not Ithagenes. He was not of pure blood. According to Diogenes, when he was once taunted about this fact, he replied, "Also the mother of the gods is Phrygian." Diogenes also informs us that he used to teach in the Synosargus Gymnasium, the place of choice for the metroxenoi that had been disenfranchised by Pericles' law because not both of their parents were of Athenian stock. They were mainly elite men, disenfranchised because of the law. Antisthenes, therefore, was one of the victims of Athenian nativism, his citizen status, at least potentially, undermined by the ideology of autochthony and by its legal ramifications. It is then not surprising that, and here I quote Liz Erwin, Antisthenes is perhaps the most damning critic of the Athenians' practice around citizenship. Almost every quotation of his that appears in Diogenes has some meaning in relation to the ideology, attitude, and practices surrounding Athenian citizenship. One telling example of this attitude is once again provided by Diogenes, who reports that Antisthenes poured contempt, I quote, on the Athenians because they were proud of their birth from the earth, gegenes, said that they were no more well-born than snails and locusts. Who was then, according to Antisthenes, truly eugenes? Well, for him, I quote again, the same people are well-born who are also endowed with virtue. Virtue is teachable, and the wise man will conduct himself in public life, not according to the legislated laws, but according to the law of virtue. What is striking in these fragments is that virtue emerges as the supreme criterion of worth, disconnected from good birth, ancestry, and in principle, even wealth, at the same time as it is pitched directly against democratic claims to share eugenia, nobility, on the basis of autochthony. Good birth, as it becomes democratized through the ideology of autochthony, is suddenly found in certain circles to be irrelevant as a criterion of worth. Now, Antisthenes has, in the later tradition at least, rather solid proletarian credentials. He dressed like a working man, preferred to teach the poor, made poverty central to his philosophy, and even denied that there are things that commoners cannot know. So I'm not going to try to argue for an elitist subtext in Antisthenes-specific positions, but it is easy to see what this rejection of democratic nativist eugenia in favor of naked virtue can do in other less proletarian hands. Virtue as the only criterion of worth, the only grounds on which one or one class can deserve to rule the city, becomes central, for example, in the far less democratically inclined philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. Yet there, virtue ends up being defined in such a way as to be unattainable by the lower classes. The famous digression on the philosophical life in Plato's Theaetetus, which you have at point 6 on your handout, provides a striking illustration of this. The Platonic Socrates starts a sustained comparison between those who have been brought up in the cause and are therefore raised and educated within the context of democratic political participation, and those who have been brought up with philosophy. He straight away marks democratic citizens vis-a-vis the philosophers, the truly virtuous, as slaves in breeding compared to the free. This particular metaphorical redefinition of freedom as to exclude the masses and include only a certain category of men is common in both Plato and Aristotle, as we shall see. And what is it that sets the philosophers apart from the slavish, wider mass of democratic citizens? It is leisure, scholae. The need to convince the judges, characterized as a master, despotes, causes the souls of the democratic citizen to become small and twisted, as they are deprived of growth, straightforwardness, and liberality, to eleutherion. Note again the metaphorical redefinition of freedom as to exclude, well, most of those who are actually free. It is not birth or wealth directly that make the mass of the democratic citizens twisted, defective, unvirtuous, and unworthy. It is their breathing, their education they receive, what they learn, and what they practice. Yet it soon becomes clear that socioeconomic conditions are not truly discounted, just hidden. After all, scholae seems to be what makes the philosopher superior, and it takes money to dedicate yourself to leisure, doesn't it? And in fact, when Plato's Socrates, later on, starts describing the leaders of the philosophers, paragons of virtue in his account, their qualities somehow depend on not even knowing where the agora is, where you need to sell stuff, where you need to work, on having no familiarity with the cause, the assembly or the council. To be sure, they are equally unfamiliar with etaereia and banquets. But there is something very disingenuous in statements by Socrates, such as the following, I quote, "Is such and such a good citizen of good or bad birth? Has so-and-so inherited some defect or other from his male or female forebears? Our philosopher is less aware of these matters than he is of how many drops there are in the proverbial ocean." Like Antisthenes, our Socrates finds claims to eugeneia rather ridiculous. He says, when people sing in praise of lineage, saying that such and such a member of the upper classes can point to 7 generations of wealthy ancestors, he considers the eulogy to be thoroughly short-sighted and due to the uneducated ability even to see things as a whole, or to work out that men and beggars, kings and slaves, thousands of each of us, for each of us, and any of them could have been a foreigner or a Greek, our one's ancestors. On the surface, this discounting of eugeneia, of origins and ancestry, of socioeconomic background, analogous to what we have found in Antisthenes, appears to be egalitarian. Yet it is not, as becomes clear in the following paragraphs. The cluelessness in all practical and political matters that is so praised in the philosopher depends, in fact, on privilege, leisure, and money. And in the end, when it comes to it, Socrates' account ends up displaying as much elitism and spite for the lower classes as the old oligarchs. So I'm going to quote from 175d that you have on the handout in full. When the time comes for that narrow-minded, litigious neurotic to explain his views on all these matters, then the tables are turned. Then the height at which, I'm just checking. Okay. Yeah, okay. Okay. Then the tables are turned. Then the height at which he's suspended and the view from the top in the air make him feel dizzy because he's not used to them. He's troubled and confused. He talks gibberish. And this is amusing, but not to Thracian girls or any other ill-bred person, for they are not to see him. It's amusing to those to all those whose upbringing was the opposite of slavish. So there are two types, Theodorus. There's the one you call the philosopher, whose upbringing has been genuinely free and unhurried, and who can't be blamed for looking simple and being useless when he's confronted with menial tasks, if, for instance, he doesn't know how to make the bed or sweeten a sauce or a flattering speech. Then there's the other one, who can do all these things keenly and quickly, but who doesn't know how to strike up an elegant and free-spirited song. No, know how to play his part in the harmony of discussion and properly celebrate the life of gods and happy men. The key stereotypes of class differentiation and denigration that we find in the old oligarch are back. Free men, rather than slaves, are the educated, those who have been brought up in scholae, in leisure, that is, with the kind of money that allows for scholae, for leisure, who never had to try their hand at menial labor or at manual labor, at menial services. God forbid they have to make their own bed, let alone do some cooking for themselves. Those that are well-versed in such lowly tasks, of course, have no style. They can't even hold a tune and engage in civilized conversation. The same fundamental incompatibility between virtue and therefore worth and manual labor is displayed in even starker terms of class denigration in Book 6 of Plato's Republic, the last text at point 6 on your handout, where the deformation that manual labor engenders is characterized not just in intellectual and moral, but also in physical terms. I quote, "You see, when the abandonment of this territory is noticed by others, inferior members of the human race, and when they also see how rich it is in renown and status, they behave like escaped convicts who take sanctuary in temples. They break away from their professions with no regrets and encroach on philosophy. In fact, they are the ones who do have some facility at their own paltry professions, because in spite of this treatment, philosophy still remains more prestigious than other occupations. And this prestige attracts, alas, a lot of people. Immature people who have been physically deformed by their jobs and by their work, and are mentally just as warped and stunted by their servile business." What this ideological construct of virtue does, in effect, is deny the lower classes any claim to worth that may justify their political prominence. It makes the very kind of life they conduct, from their occupations all the way to the forms of their political participation, the reason why they cannot be virtuous. It also gets rid completely of eugenia, of ancestry or nobility, as a plausible criterion of worth. This is superficially an equalizing move, but in fact, given the role of the ideology of autochthony in democratic ideology, ends up being another exclusionary move. It even redefines freedom, the most basic criterion of shared worth the Greeks could think of, so as to be unattainable by the lower classes, by linking it to leisure, which depends on wealth, and contrasting it with all forms of manual labor, which is always slavish for them. The lower classes' unworthiness by the and notionally stable differential statuses, but rather by an appeal to virtue and epistemic excellence as, by its very definition, unattainable to them. And if in Plato we find this ideological move accompanied by the most distasteful forms of class denigration, with Aristotle, despite his avoidance of classist excesses in the language, the substance remains more or less the same. In his ideal city of politics 7 and 8, for instance, the basic criterion for the selection of what should be taught to the future citizens is liberality, defined in opposition to all that is slavish and banausic, typical of manual labor, linked to work, to the world of work. The city, he thinks, should teach future citizens what will make them virtuous, and those habits and skills that are relevant to a liberal lifestyle, the agogé, characterized by leisure. Scholae is the criterion. What is necessary and useful for the basic needs of life, daily life, all that is banausikon or thetikon in Aristotle, is appropriate for slaves, not for citizens, and not for the free. And therefore, manual laborers of all kinds are not, in Aristotle's ideal city, part of the citizen group. They are excluded precisely because their occupations and their very lifestyle warp and distort their bodies and their souls in such a way as to make them incapable of virtue, which is the only criterion of worth that can justify membership in a citizen group. What these passages show is that an ideology of aristocracy, understood literally as one that maintains that only the virtues should have a right to full citizenship, which includes political participation, emerged contextually with criticism of eugeneia and autochthony. While aristocratic arguments had the potential of exercising a force towards social inclusion, in that they were critical of the most exclusionary, the most nativist elements of democratic ideology, the role they actually ended up playing, for the most part, was one that had to do with exclusion simpliciter. They came to justify, that is, the exclusion of the lower classes from the government of the city, characterizing them as, by definition, unworthy. And if the example that I have chosen to illustrate this ideological move come from high intellectual reflection, we have evidence that such arguments found with wider currency and were easily recognizable and often used against democracy. We find them, for instance, in the Theban herald's reply to Theseus in Euripides' Suppliants. You have it at point 7 on the handout. When he asks, besides, how would the people, if it cannot form true judgments, be able rightly to direct the state? No, it is time, not haste, that affords a better understanding. A poor farmer, even if he were not unschooled, would still be enabled from his toil to give his mind to politics. Once again, the kind of virtue characterized here as knowledge, intelligence, necessary for one to be worthy of political participation, is declared to be unavailable to the lower classes, however much effort they may put even into educating themselves. And we may add, however noble their ancestry may be, because of the nature of their lifestyle and occupations, which do not afford them enough time this time, shorthand for scolae, to be virtuous. So what I have tried to delineate so far are the basic coordinates of a debate about the legitimacy of democracy, which is at its core a debate on whether the lower classes can be worthy of political participation. The discourse of autochthony is central to this debate. It was the key ideological tool through which traditional criteria of worth, such as ancestry, nobility, lineage, eugeneia, were democratized in an attempt to break the automatic association of wealth, good birth, and moral qualities that we see taken for granted in the old oligarch, for instance. One of the responses devised by the elites was to discount traditional notions of eugeneia altogether as a reliable criterion of worth, in the process dismissing, therefore, also autochthony and shared eugeneia, at the same time redefining virtue in such a way as to be connected to a specific lifestyle, to leisure, and in opposition to manual labor, in such a way as to exclude the lower classes. The democratic response to this move, unsurprisingly, was first of all forcefully to deny that the elite and its preferred oligarchic constitutional option had a monopoly of virtue. Thrasybulus' speech to the defeated oligarchs after the regime of the 30 makes this point explicitly, denying that the oligarchs are superior to the many in the Caiosyne, Andrea, and Nomen, in any form of virtue, essentially. A connected strategy was to appropriate and democratize virtue too. The honor system and the routine enactment of honorary decrees for boards of magistrates selected by lot, with a number of cardinal virtues standardly ascribed to all honorands and essentially to all Athenians, is evidence of this move. But the ideology of autochthony remains central also to this step of the debate, because autochthony came to be presented not just as grounds for shared nobility, but as the reason for which the Athenians are all virtuous, more virtuous, in fact, than anyone else. The Athenians, that is, doubled down on their autochthony, putting ever more stock on their nativism to justify their collective worth against aristocratic criticism. one just needs to remind oneself of the passage of the wasps that I mentioned before. There, autochthony and the virtue of bravery, the bravest of all people, are seamlessly connected and associated to a group of judges explicitly characterized as poor, as working class. And the extant funeral orations often make the point that the Athenians, because they have never moved, they are sprung of the earth, are ethnically homogeneous, and so on, form a more harmonious and cohesive community characterized by a deeper attachment to their land, which translates into innately superior qualities of patriotism and bravery. Other mongrel polis need to teach bravery and public service to their citizens. And the Athenians, all of them, are naturally virtuous because they are autochthonous. That's the argument. That's how it goes. So I come now to some provisional conclusions. It is a truism that our preoccupations as historians, our research questions, and the very manner in which these questions are framed are conditioned by our modern perspectives, by the problems and questions of our time. It is therefore both easily explainable and very welcome from a historiographical point of view that recent decades have somewhat recentered our historical inquiries to focus more on the various subaltern sections of the population of the Greek cities that fell outside the main male citizen group. We now know more about women, foreigners, slaves, about their place in the polis, and also about how polis ideology excluded, marginalized, and exploited them. This recentering of our outlook has also radically altered our picture of what the citizen group actually was within the polis. Faced with the large number of inhabitants of a city like Athens that were left out, many historians have begun to reconceptualize the citizens, even of democracy, as an oligarchy sui generis, whatever the claims of democracy they may have put. In Athens, they were a subsection of the free adult males whose citizen credentials were underpinned by a nativist ideology that othered and therefore excluded everyone else. There's no way around it. This picture is to a significant extent correct. It is also rather appealing, though, we should say, because it chimes in with the positions and the political instincts of the right-thinking, compassionate, respectable, liberal, normally mildly left-wing political demographic that is dominant in our disciplines. We are, by and large, appalled by Brexit, Trump, and here in Italy, Giorgia Meloni and Matteo Salvini, by the resurgence of nativism, nativist nationalism, often in a populist guise, by the mounting anti-immigration sentiment roused by unscrupulous politicians and enthusiastically endorsed by large sections of the old working classes. Think of the Labour heartlands in the UK swinging heavily towards Brexit, as they have. A democracy founded on nativism and exclusion is no democracy. Or is it? In the same way as the questions we ask of the ancient evidence tend to reflect our modern preoccupations, the historical answers we come up with sometimes have a way of showcasing our modern blind spots, I think. What I've tried to do tonight is to highlight one such blind spot. If I had to sum it up in a few words, I would say that the welcome and much needed turn in recent decades toward a new focus on outsiders and subaltern groups has often suffered from a certain class blindness. Understanding the citizen group as an oligarchy sui generis, as an elite, is somewhat class blind, straightforwardly, because it runs counter to the large number of ancient sources that describe democracy as a regime controlled by the poor and the working men. Those very lower classes that Greek elites spend so much ideological and institutional ingenuity in trying to disenfranchise. The evidence makes it very clear, that is, that the citizen group in Athens was, in fact, comparatively inclusive from a socioeconomic point of view, giving full rights to all Athenians, irrespective of how high or low their socioeconomic condition was. There were citizens of very modest means, even poor, actually poor citizens in Athens, whereas poverty or even just modest means were grounds for exclusion in many other cities. Characterizing these citizens as an elite or as oligarchs in their own way runs the risk of concealing more than it reveals. But the issue is not just one of correctly characterizing the citizen population of democratic Athens. It is to do with situating these causes of democratic exclusion, such as that of autochthony, where they belong, within a dynamic of ideological class warfare in which the rich are attempting to make a case for the lower classes not being worthy of full citizenship, including political participation and political power. And the lower classes, in contrast, needed to affirm their worth to justify their inclusion. The discourse of autochthony cannot be understood, therefore, in isolation. And while it is true that it relied on othering foreigners and slaves, it is less clear that they actually contributed to othering women specifically, because women were part of the underpinning of this nativist ideology. It was double birth, after all, that made one autochthonous and Athenian. It is doubtful that these categories were the only and even the primary ideological and polemical target of this discourse. Its target was also a discourse of nobility and aristocracy that emerged concurrently from the upper classes as a way of questioning the right of the lower classes to hold political office, make proposals and decisions in the assembly, render judgment in the law courts. This discourse used the language of merit, desert, and virtue to make a case for the exclusion of the lower classes from the running of the city. It was a discourse of class denigration, pure and simple. At its simplest, this discourse wanted full citizen rights to be associated with good birth. The discourse of autochthony responded to this exclusionary criterion of worth by claiming good birth for all Athenians, equal in their eugenia because they all sprung from the earth, or at least because they had lived in Athens from time immemorial. The passages from Antisthenes that I discussed before are evidence of another episode of this class war. Virtue came to be opposed to birth as the most appropriate criterion of citizenship. This ideological move was, on the surface, an inclusive one, as he rejected a nativist criterion of worth and notionally replaced it with one that did not a priori exclude foreigners. In reality, virtue and merit were, as they still are, bound to become shorthand for money. They invariably end up disqualifying the lower classes. Concurrently with this shift, we see, in fact, the emergence of discourses of virtue, particularly evident in Plato and Aristotle, but spread way beyond them, which associate, as I mentioned, with scholae, with leisure, free time, and a liberal education. Virtue, in this construction, was by definition incompatible with manual labor, and manual work was therefore in itself slavish and disqualifying. Not only that, but this ideology of virtue, an aristocratic ideology, we should define it, also attempted to redefine freedom as the criterion for full citizenship. Being eleutherous was not quite enough. One needed to be eleutherios, which once again was connected with leisure, with scholae, with free time, with having, in fact, enough money not to have to work. And accordingly, manual occupations were typical of slaves, and the lower classes were therefore not that different from slaves at all. The very same discourse that on the surface appeared to have the potential for inclusion along ethnic lines was one of utter exclusion and denigration along socioeconomic lines. In response, the discourse of autochthony proceeded to democratize virtue too. As the funeral orations often argue, the Athenians are not brave patriotical virtues because of training or instruction. They just are because they have a deeper connection with their land. They are autochthonous, and therefore they are more cohesive, more harmonious. They're more inclined to serve the city. Situating the discourse, and now I really conclude, the discourse of autochthony where it belongs, in the context of dynamic of class ideological warfare between the elites disgruntled with political participation being extended to the lower classes, and the lower classes keen to justify their right to participation, their worthiness as full citizens, is not just, I think, a corrective to scholarly trend that see the discourse of autochthony as just exclusionary. It also helps appreciate the unfortunate, tragic trade-off between inclusion and exclusion that often lies behind nativism. Discourses of merit and virtue tend to impose criteria of worth that are by design unattainable by the lower classes, precisely because of their economic condition. Today, the discourse of meritocracy, as shown by Michael Sandel and many others, performs precisely this function. It connects worth and merit with success and achievement, money. At the same time, implying that those who do not succeed are, by definition, undeserving, otherwise they would have succeeded. The underlying theory of value obscures the effects of socioeconomic inequality, while at the same time justifying its existence. In the face of such an ideology, which by design denies a sense of self-worth to vast swathes of the population, it is not surprising that the lower classes should find nativist or even simply nationalist discourses appealing, however distasteful they might be. What such discourses do is carve out an inclusive and at least in principle egalitarian identity for members of the in-group that is by definition worthy, deserving, honorable. It is no longer about what you do achieve or what most often cannot achieve, but rather about who you are, where you're born, who your parents are. That is enough for you to achieve a positive sense of self in the face of elitist ideologies hell-bent on denying you one. Yet such nativist discourses do this comparatively by characterizing outsiders as un or less worthy. They are therefore at the same time inclusive and heavily exclusionary, yet along different axes. We cannot fully understand them and, in our modern world, if we were so inclined, combat them, unless we acknowledge the fundamental trade-off they embody between different axes of inclusion and exclusion. And most importantly, unless we recognize the role of elitist discourses of class denigration in fostering this trade-off and making nativist discourses appealing to the lower classes. Thank you.
This is wide-ranging, provocative,
Questions come up immediately. I will start with the most obvious one. When we look at modern nativist discourses, they are not, as far as one can tell, an instrument for class struggle. They are an instrument for creating support in among the lower classes against their interests. The example you brought up, and I'm afraid I have to go back to, was Great Britain leaving the European Union with important support from traditionally lower class parts of Great Britain who voted against their own interests.
Mm-hmm.
Is there where the analogy with Athenian autochthony stops?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it does, but only to an extent. That is, I think the trade-off, you see that working that way, not only in favor of the working classes, but in fact against them in certain instances also in ancient democracy. For example, I always kind of think about the regime of the 30 tyrants and the aftermath of that. What you have is a regime that embodies this kind of class denigration and the merging together of everybody who doesn't have leisure, doesn't have money, into kind of generically disenfranchised and slavish. In the opposition to the regime, you do effectively find an alliance of lower class, working class Athenians, foreign residents, and indeed slaves. There is a kind of a moment in which you seem to have some kind of coalition whose raison d'etre is a class-based. They are made into a class by their being kind of conflated and excluded, and they fight together. And there is even for a fleeting moment afterwards proposals to enfranchise slaves, to give citizenship to foreigners, and then the autochthony stuff comes in. And then this stuff is cancelled out. And then suddenly they forget about all that and they decide that, well, let's close up again. And one may argue they make themselves more vulnerable again. So I think you see that happening at certain moments, at certain points. I think the nativist discourses in ancient Athens were functional to the sense of self-worth of the Athenians and were made worse by elitist and classist denigration. I do not think that means that they were absolutely the best way to do their own interests. In fact, it's arguable they were not. It was a limit imposed on their democratic self-image by the very context of class struggle in which they operated. So they could have done better for themselves if they hadn't done that. But so that would be my answer to that question.
Points which have been slightly obvious the arguments that not always slightly outside. First is that it's all the representations are based on strictly, let me say, realistic. Whereas not apart from timid tripartite, say, statement, is fundamentally have that kind of position. Be that on the contrary, say in Roman Catholic schools, tripartite, which is the final point. But in any case, tripartite representations are quite common. Say cultures, so I was wondering, has the territorium non datum by definition, or is there any attempt to construct a tripartite ideology within the European system? So there's another point which was here. Autochthony sounds, I would say, quite obvious within the Athenian schools. But of course, many arguments, the autochthony argument wouldn't sound convincing at all. The Spartan, it would be just the opposite. So is there any conscious construction of let's say differentiation between Athenian public culture and other always under that respect, or the autochthony argument say doesn't seem to have anything oppositional, say.
Thank you very much. Yes, both excellent questions. So on the first questions, there are attempts to replace this bipartite, which is the dominant one, with a tripartite. Aristotle famously makes the point that he says that the best regime would be one in which the Mesoi are in charge. But then he goes on to say, because the Mesois, there's very few Mesois anywhere, that's kind of impossible. So the second best or the third best would be to mix it up and give some institution to the rich and some institution to the poor. The funny thing about this, in a way, is that people that have worked in recent years about wealth and income distribution in Athens and in other cities, in fact, they try to make the argument that there is a large middle class and that the curve is not like, inequality is not massive. And yes, you've got some very poor people, but by and large, you have kind of a... So there is obviously a difference between what is a real distribution of wealth and income and how this community sees itself, and particularly in what the discourse does. And that's why I think talking about the stuff in class terms actually helps, because these are not oppositions that are necessarily intrinsic in the distribution of wealth. These are occupations that are construed as binary. They see that binary and they create it. And it's not even always the same opposition. Like there are certain moments in which the main axis of the opposition is, for example, leisure of work. And in that sense, there is a leisure class and there is a working class. Of course, in other contexts, like after, like a few months after the restoration of democracy in the 30s, the main primary opposition becomes once again whether you're free or a slave, and that kind of thing. And you could make kind of a spectrum of this stuff, but doesn't explain much in historical context. It's more a matter of what identity and what self-identification opposition to somebody else is relevant at any given point. So it is like one of the funny, Josiah Ober, that wrote one of the most famous books in ancient history of the last generation, he became famous with a book called Mass and Elite. And then in recent years, he's been kind of playing with the distribution and saying, look, there's a massive middle class. But that's not how they see themselves. And that's not how the rich see them. If you have to work for a living, you have to work for a living. So that's the first answer. And it's precisely because it's construction that is interesting to me. The second question, so you have some cities where they have some notions of autochthony. Thebes is another one. In Athens, what we may call a nativist or at least kind of ethnic exceptionalism ideology that works in this particular way is attached to autochthony as being born from the earth there. Elsewhere, in communities that are by their own collective memory, originally migrant community, they replace that with very strong notions of consanguinity and we all Dorian and we all came together, or we all descendants of this guy, or we all descendants of this other guy. So you have effectively a variety of nativist ideologies which build and contribute to the creation of certain kind of collective memories. In Athens, it's autochthony. In many places, it's not strictly speaking autochthony, it's something else. But they do in democratic cities seem to perform a similar function. In colonist communities like Syracuse, you would have original settlers kind of ideology. And in Cyrene, you would have descendant from a particular king or a particular kind of group, that kind of thing. So they all kind of do the same thing in slightly different ways, I guess.
The autochthony argument, I think that in the Roman Catholic, for example, or the rights of citizenship, no exist.
No.
Is the peculiarity of the Greek culture is autochthony argument, I think. It's curious because in the Roman colony, we are not the problem of autochthony argument.
No, there is a mythology of a kind of a motley crew or a city that is emerged from migration and people from different places. I mean, that also goes together with starkly different approaches to citizenship. Like Philippe Gautier wrote a famous article many years ago about Greek avarice and Roman generosity about citizenship. And he said that, for example, freed slaves in Rome were Roman citizens. In Greece, free slaves were not citizens. They were free slaves. And then they could become citizens if they were naturalized, but that was incredibly rare and didn't normally happen. And likewise, access to the citizen group in Rome was much easier for foreigners. There was kind of a wide, in Greece, there was a certain attachment to the in-group. Gautier's argument, though, was that part of the reason was, of course, that Rome, whatever Fergus Miller wanted to convince us of, was never a democracy, which means that being a citizen came with certain rights, but didn't come with the same level of stake in the community overall. They were not going and kind of making decisions or making proposals. And the fact is that in Greek cities, it's not that foreigners had no rights. They had plenty of rights. They could go to court, they could bring charges, they had considerable legal agency. They just could not decide. They could not contribute to decision-making. So I think that's another example in which doing more work, I would that would be the institutional side of the argument about the trade-off that I tried to make here on the ideological one. There seems to be a trade-off between active inclusion on socioeconomic grounds at all levels and how generous you are. And the Greek cities, there is some evidence that they became a bit more generous about giving citizenship in the later Hellenistic period, just as they became more elitist in their institutional structure, and being a citizen meant less in itself in terms of self-government and participation.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to dig into the Diogenes there passage in section 5 on Athenians, the idea of other denigration. Try to do kind of possible and find lots of argumentation, but I can give you source. First is someone very wealthy, thinking of someone like Thucydides' family or Hippocrates, and so on and so forth, and actually marry into the royal family race or something like that. The other one is kind of on the bottom, where there's a nice example in Aristotle's 1342 side of trading a stillborn baby, a free woman, for a slave baby, bringing it up as you want to have a family with an heir, and you can't get one the normal way, and this is a way. Of course, it becomes really difficult to detect that unless they live physically different. So there's an interesting passage in Theophrastus's characters, so there's the disgusting man. He has a kind of inherited family skin disease. And he treats this as a kind of good thing, because then he can tell that his son's really his son. Because it'd be put in there by a white costs.
Yeah.
So
that's very interesting.
There's that accusation of foreign ancestry can operate on these different axes. I'm wondering how it feeds into wider.
But that's why, I mean, that's very interesting. That is actually why, like, I was mildly, or at least kind of cautious about Antisthenes' proletarian credentials, because that's mostly later sources. And they make a point about kind of foreign ancestry. They seem to play those later sources on the second version of what you're saying, having a slave. But the guy's activity is set in Kinosages. And he seems to be associated to metroxenoi and that kind of elite world of people with a Thracian mom and so on. So I like, in an initial version of this paper, I wanted to try to argue that Antisthenes was posh too. And then kind of I gave up and I said, perhaps I don't need to go that far and try to, but I did once here a paper, but I wanted to introduce some caution because I did once hear a paper by Tim Whitmarsh that took it as completely understood that he was a lower class representative, argued from that that probably also the Kinosages, the gymnasium, was not really an elite space, and then went on to characterize these arguments against citizenship and autochthony as what he called hyper-democratic. And I was thinking, I think that misses too much. There is an issue here about the trade-off that is like, we see only one direction of travel. There are two opposing ones.
Yeah, I'm wondering which one, what he uses there. Because he seems to accept that this criticism is true. So,
yeah.
With the aristocratic marrying problems, that's something everyone is involved in.
Yeah.
The other one is pushed out. If you look at a different making these accusations, they didn't number one genetics about traits.
Do you think Socrates had many students that were actually lower class? But I don't think so. So that no. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think absolutely. I think essentially the existence, even like beyond the ideology per se, but the existence of slavery as the ultimate kind of non-status, the one you don't want, underpins all of this. I mean, elitist strategies of exclusion of the lower classes in Athens are predicated on the fact that they are like slaves. Working class strategies of justifying their worthiness and inclusion seem to kind of oscillate between opposing themselves to the elite by saying, who do you think you are? We're actually good too. But also saying, we really are not like them. We are not slaves. So it's a fun, that's why I was talking about there being a tragic trade-off, because what you have here is not much like, at least the way I see it, a spectrum of statuses as Finley would have had it, but rather you have multiple partially overlapping class of position, very conscious class of position, and the slaves are the losing side in all of them, essentially. I missed that, sorry. Mm-hmm. You mean opposition to slavery as an institution overall? Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's, I mean, it's, of course, Aristotle mentions the opposition to slavery just to make the argument that slavery is natural, to justify slavery. I think, essentially, I think the problem is not a problem typical just of the Greek word. It's a problem inherent in most slave societies that that's kind of the presence of slaves is predicated on some kind of like ideological fiction. You treat human beings as an item of property. They are valuable to you because of qualities that are essentially human, yet you pretend they're not human. And that's what you have to try to do. So you find all these kind of ideologies about pretending. Bernard Williams talked about the fact that slavery is not a necessary identity, but all these ideologies of slavery try very hard to make it look like necessary, but it's a very open kind of self-deception. You can make an argument that slaves are by nature, but then you know that one day you're a slave and the next day you're not. You're freeing people, you're enslaving people, you're doing all of this kind of thing. I think the issue there is not much that they cannot. I'm sure there were people that criticize slavery overall. I'm sure there were people that criticize the enslavement of certain people. Think about the third Olympiad with the Olympian woman and the old argument, look how virtuous and wonderful and free like she is. You can't treat her as a slave. It's just an accident that she is a slave. You have all of that, but also there's a lot of evidence for the uncanny ability of human beings and masters in slave society for self-deception. If you want hard enough and it's convenient for you, you can get yourself to believe in anything, however absurd that may be. So I think that's where we are working, where at the intersection we are working here.
Another component of that is the treatment of the body. So, like, it fits very well with what you're saying. For me, it's redefining freedom in terms of something derived from school. I think there are oligarchies in liquidity cities or inspired. Part of the public upbringing involves getting beaten quite a lot, with physical punishment And this even comes through in archaeology into some of the physical remains that we have seen by archaeologists. Interesting, we were from a bone specialist who frequently find this grave. It was obviously a high status grave and a particularly nice part of the cemetery. There was a lot of trauma to the body. It's perfectly with what's we know from various institutions that being a whatever in Sparta doesn't exactly for physical mystery.
Bacteria.
But in democratic Athens, they're super sensitive about anyone manhandling. You even need to get public slaves in so that you don't have one citizen physically manhandling another. There's absolutely no question of the punishments of the free poor in terms of physical penalties. There's these claims that the difference between the free man and the slave is the free man answers in terms of fines for this kind of question. Answers flows of state. So I think that's one component of the democratic ideology of freedom. And also that they physically look different. They don't bear these typically bear these scars and holes. It's maybe a scar.
Yeah. I think it's that's on point. Yeah. I mean, there's a good it's a kind of thing Bianca and I used to work with about when we were talking about honor, about it makes a difference it makes a difference essentially how wide your stock of social esteem it is, and how many honorable qualities you can appeal to essentially, and how many degrees of separation there are, for example, between you and a slave. For a Spartan, for a member of the Spartan class in Sparta, like being beaten up by somebody does not make you into a hell. There are so many things that divide you from a hell, from wealth to clothing to the way to the grooming and stuff like that. In a democratic city, there is the issue that working men citizens do work side by side with slaves every day. They often conduct probably fairly, some of them conduct fairly similar lives as slaves in a work. So that makes them hypersensitive to those marks of esteem that set them apart from slaves, which means that in Sparta, for example, for a free man to be beaten up by a magistrate, who cares? I mean, that's part of discipline. In Athens, that's treating a poor citizen as if he were a slave. It's exactly what's going on there, I think.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering one thing about the relation with the massive groups of people outside Africa that are being integrated between the citizenship and the mass naturalization, exiles, refugees, and in conclusion, clerics, because they are outside the boundaries, the territorial boundaries of Africa. So they, you could say, a close definition of autochthony. How can these relationships outside Africa can get along with these kind of discourses about exclusion and inclusion?
Yeah. But I mean, we always have to keep in mind this ideological warfare doesn't have to kind of be tight. Doesn't need to work. For example, like you can naturalize somebody from elsewhere. You can naturalize a group. You can naturalize a slave. They call them poietoi or demopoietoi, made by the demos. No, there are sometimes some kind of limitations, like you need to, in order to become a magistrate or to do a certain magistracy, you need to be third generation or something like that. But after a while, you kind of get integrated, and I think that's one of those instances in which, after a while, it's in the interest of both parties to kind of forget that they were not part of they did not come from elsewhere. You can keep the integrity together. For certain groups, like, I don't know, the Plataeans most famously must have worked slightly differently. These people don't need an autochthonous claim because they have a very different claim, which is as honorable. They were the one that fought with the Athenians from the beginning. They were the one that never left their side. They were the one that were maltreated by the Spartans. There's a very good reason for which they have Athenian citizenship. And having that is not incompatible with maintaining a Plataean identity, for example. Likewise, for other kind of exiled communities or exiled groups like the ones you find in the Against Leptinus, like you've got the Samians, you've got those ones. These are people that are temporarily there. They are treated as Athenian. They wait to go back in a way, no? But apart from these groups and so on, there is an assumption. Like, think about Apollodorus, the son of Paetion. Yes, he's not autochthonous per se. He's the son of a slave or of an ex-slave, no? But surely that he doesn't want to tell anybody. Like, he's got no interest in anybody kind of remembering that. He's very keen on that being lost in translation, and he just kind of merging into the overall discourse. And in fact, he does it very effectively. He talks about autochthony. He talks about autochthonous Athenians in his speech, which is paradoxical, but.
Steve, your question points to important paradox that autochthony is ultimately genealogical. It is depicted as spatial. It is depicted as being about where it come from. But in fact, it isn't, because you remain autochthonous even as long as you are a legitimate Athenian citizen, even if you were slaves. Okay, thank you again for this presentation. This questions we have shown were highly provocative, and we will keep discussing it in the future. Thank you.